This one's an oldie but goodie I've stumbled upon recently. I'm going to take a crack at responding to Seedling.
Hey y'all! This is another video I'm doing in a series with Everyday Feminism, which you probably know is a website dedicated to helping you break down and stand up to everyday oppression.
Everyday Feminism is a place where confused, entitled social justice warriors use more confused propaganda to attempt to destroy the fabric of society, whatever is left of it, that is, by preying on feeble minds much in the way that the religious attempt to poison our freedom of thought to make us unable to have our own thoughts. It is a clearinghouse of the mentally ill and infinitely baffled.
And in this video, I want to talk to the white people in my audience. And I want to talk about something that we tend to do a lot. So it's not uncommon in the social justice community to hear, "I didn't know," in response to being called out on racist behavior.
Was I the only one that picked up on the phrase in a social justice community? Of course I wasn't. Instead of a community of people, she is focusing inward into the deep echo chamber of the oppression Olympics and virtue signaling world. This phrase instantly conjures a scene from Can You Top This?, where eventually details of no significance are pulled apart and picked at to the point where they are now forced into inventing things to be outraged about.
And white people, including myself sometimes, have a tendency to claim ignorance when we're confronted with the uncomfortable truth that we have a great deal of racial privilege.
Is that right? Claiming ignorance about your delusion that you have racial privilege is your excuse? I highly recommend a re-education camp for healing from toxic whiteness for you. I'm not about to say that minorities in some countries have it as easy as the majority, but do listen to this. Your narcissistic, Western-centric view of the world keeps you from realizing that there are other parts of the world where us toxic white people are the minority. There are even other parts of the world where one non-white minority is severely oppressed by another non-white minority. You open the door to this by not saying where you are talking about. The entitled SJW class are all nodding their heads because they already know you're putting down the evil white male patriarchy. Due to that same Western-centric narcissism you see in the actual privileged world of middle and upper class social justice warriors, survival by your own hard work is not an issue. The issue is not equality of opportunity, it is the equality of outcome. Common sense tells us that there are people all over the world, regardless of their skin color or beliefs, who struggle to stave off starvation. Those who are forced to sit by and watch their children die from easily treated illnesses or diseases. This isn't very important to you because, you know, things like saying you didn't know when being called out for a racist behavior is,
and what we do and say can be harmful even without bad intentions.
This reminds me of the woman who wore a hijab, found that people were just darned awfully nice to her. So her conclusion was that they were all racist. Link to the article in the description. It seems to me that we cannot determine others' intention. This, I pick on your point here because it is an often used tactic by the SJW crowd to read minds. When a terrorist blows up a crowd of innocent bystanders in the name of Allah, the social justice warriors are tripping over each other trying to tell us what that person was really thinking. They can read minds, you see. This self-proclaimed Muslim is really not a Muslim because you know his mind better than his. Remember, you're playing the same game as the Republicans who hated President Obama, a self-described Christian. No way, they knew better. He had to be a Muslim. Self-proclaiming your faith does not hold up against those clever mind readers who know more about your thoughts than you do.
So this is no doubt frustrating for people of color who are constantly confronted with white people claiming ignorance. So it's almost as if it serves white comfort and white dominance to remain ignorant, to avoid stirring up the pot enough to shake us from our place in the hierarchy. So, well, white people, I think it's time that we stop saying "I didn't know" as if it absolves us. White ignorance is something that we all need to better understand in order to move forward toward a more racially just society. And there's actually a philosophical theory that can help explain this phenomenon.
Here's a philosophical theory to explain your ignorance. Well, maybe it's not as much philosophical as common sense advice. It's probably more frustrating to people of color that other people are just plain racist with no apology or excuse. And there is no excuse for hating others for the way they were born. You are suggesting a racist that has an excuse because a person knows no better. I personally have lived in many places in the U.S. and have not heard this ignorance you claim. Maybe people use it, but instead of being condescending to them with your virtue signaling, maybe it's a great opportunity to say something that would be helpful, you think?
And how to move past it. So it's called white ignorance.
What an original name for a theory. Pure genius, I say.
And we need to talk about it to understand racism on a deeper level. White ignorance is used within philosophy of race to understand the ways white supremacy holds itself in place by allowing and actually encouraging white people to ignore the realities of race.
Deeper level? Let me help you here by defining racism. Let's check the good old white people Merriam-Webster definition of it. A belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacity, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Do you notice that nowhere in that definition of racism did they mention that it must be white people who are racist or have white ignorance? I didn't either. Do you know why? Because anyone of any race can be the recipient of racism by others of another race. Aren't you ashamed of beating this dead horse into the ground about all whites must be racist? That's why there must be white ignorance of it.
So the social and political philosopher named Charles Mills argues that white ignorance is a cognitive phenomenon generated and sustained by our current social structure. So what that means is that white ignorance is distinct from general patterns of ignorance, in that white ignorance is a direct or indirect result of the existence of racial categories. So, a racist white person who forms untrue beliefs about black people displays white ignorance.
Charles Mill's main research interests are in political theory, radical and oppositional, particularly around issues of social class, gender, and race. He has published numerous articles on Marxism, critical race theory, and African American philosophy. In The Social Construct, Mills postulates that racism and white supremacy is still the de facto practice and ideology among political and economic institutions around the world, which are dominated or influenced by members of the tribes of Europe. Ceedling, aren't you part of that tribe?
But so does a non-racist person who has formed mistaken beliefs about black people because of some structural inequality, such as the social suppression of relevant knowledge. So some relevant knowledge would be that after the abolition of slavery in the US, blacks still did not have opportunities equal to whites. So if you have the mistaken belief that they did have equal opportunities like the moment after slavery was abolished, then you're going to form other mistaken beliefs from that basis. In other words, even without the explicit bias against non-white people, whites can and do perpetuate inequality through ignorance. So, put simply, even if you don't have any racist beliefs, you can still act in racist ways through pure ignorance. And that's why it's so important as white people that we understand how our own ignorance plays a part in the ongoing oppression of people of color. So, Charles Mills argues that society has created a racialized moral psychology by dividing the world into persons and subpersons. So this psychology allows white people to have racist thoughts and act in racist ways without recognizing these behavior patterns as racist. So that means that white ignorance is a kind of blindness that is structured by a society in which whites are socialized and politicized not to think too much about the nature of race relations and privilege, because it benefits us as a racial group to not think about race. It's not only uncomfortable to talk about it, but it's actually harmful to the status quo to have these tough conversations, which is why we absolutely need to have them.
It's difficult to imagine this world you have conjured up, the one that people do not know about, the Jim Crow South. I know you're young and can claim ignorance about history because of that youth, but for over 100 years the United States experienced massive social inequity between the races after the Civil War that became front and center in all media due to the civil rights movement starting mid-century and culminated in the country viewing the bus boycotts, the end of voter suppression against minorities, and black children being led into schools by the National Guard on live TV to end school segregation. You probably weren't alive to witness this plastered across newspaper headlines and television screens reporting, and that's okay. Many of us weren't born yet either. But to say in the 21st century that white folks had no idea of institutional racism that existed prior to the 1970s is to say it is your ignorance of race relations that is in question here. I have to pick at your comment about even though you aren't racist, acting in racist ways due to ignorance is a thing. You see, there is a thing called consideration. When you open a door for a complete stranger, never mind that feminists find the issues with this kindness, but alas, another story. But kindness or consideration of others has meaning. I assume you might be referring to actions that are so close to non-existent that they are termed microaggression. When I say consideration has meaning, opening a door for someone is easy, but deliberately being shitty to someone is just that, shitty. And most adults do know the difference. You are suggesting that white people are morons and do not understand what it means to be a good person, and being a good person suggests being good to others. Now, of course, all black people are immune to the same accusation because just by being black, you are a certifiable paragon of perfection, and whites are just a bunch of half-witted, inbred ninnies that don't know right from wrong.
So this kind of institutionalized ignorance has concrete consequences. So for instance, textbooks are whitewashed by downplaying events of considerable importance which might disrupt the version of history that we're taught, which is comfortable for whites. So recently, there's a Texas geography textbook which referred to Africans brought to American plantations between the 1500s and 1800s as workers rather than slaves. This is a textbook in 2015. It was caught by a parent. This is not okay. This is definitely downplaying certain realities, and that's incredibly harmful.
Whitewashed? Nice touch there. The bigger picture here, and there is one, is that history is written by the victors, and this applies to states where one political party has gained control of their government. It's not as much that they're removing the history of racism from our past, and they are, but the bigger picture here is the ruling class. The ruling class has no color code, no tribes from Europe. If you've read Jane Mayer's recent book, Dark Money, The Hidden History of the Billionaires, you will see that those at the top are interested in one color, and that's green, and power, which has no color. Unless you read the critical theory propaganda of Charles Mills, which apparently you have. You might not know this.
Also, the fact that we're taught and celebrate the discovery of countries which were actually already inhabited by people is a blatant instance of ignorance, perpetuating ignorance. So, and this ignorance is taught. We know the truth is that this was not a true discovery of empty lands, but it's uncomfortable to present it as what it really was, imperialism and genocide. So we continue to churn out the same stories to encourage a feel-good history for white people. And the denial of the extent of Native American and Black victimization in North America reinforces this airbrushed white narrative of discovery and settlement. But you see, this editing of white memory enables a self-representation for us white people in which white privilege and the need to correct for it doesn't exist. So in other words, the way that we understand and learn about the past has an obvious effect on how we perceive the present.
And you are privy to this arcane knowledge of our deep, dark, secret past because you spent decades poring over ancient manuscripts in dusty cellars until you discovered the truth? No. Like me, you read it in a history book. Yes, my college American history book informed me of our checkered past. It is when you buy into critical theory you become confused, yes, and ignorant.
Another example, some white college students wear blackface in celebration of Martin Luther King Day, and they claim, oh, we didn't know that we were being racist. We were just celebrating. So it's actually their privilege, along with a unique kind of ignorance, which allows them to ignore the realities of racial injustice and the history of blackface. And they may have been truly ignorant of these things, but their actions still have negative consequences for people of color. They still acted in a racist way, regardless of their ignorance. So that's important to remember.
So kind and charitable of you to help those young college lads out, but it is the 21st century, and I can't imagine anyone not knowing that blackface is racist. It helps fit into your narrative to pretend to believe that when people are caught doing something hurtful, hateful, and wrong, they will throw out an excuse that only the naive could believe. But you have this idea in your head of white ignorance, and stupid excuses for bad actions works well for you. Since I live in the real world, I say people do racist things for racist reasons and plead ignorance when they get caught. Replace racist with any other wrongful act and you'll see what I mean. Not seeing this is a special kind of ignorance.
And I thought I would talk about a more personal example. A few years ago now, I don't know how many, before I took it upon myself to seek out resources on feminism and how to be a better ally, I too thought that ignorance absolved me of things. I painted my face one day with Sugar Skull Day of the Dead face paint without realizing the culturally appropriative consequences of doing that. I posted it on my Tumblr, and I got a appropriately critical response from some followers. And I felt really defensive. I remember I was like, hey, I didn't do anything wrong. And then once I got over that defensiveness, I felt like, well, I didn't know better. I didn't know, so I can't really be blamed for this. But it really wasn't about blame. It wasn't even about me. It's about a system which is so white-centric that I can paint my face with arguably the worst Day of the Dead makeup attempt ever. It was terrible. To look more, interesting, look more exotic. Well, I was at the same time ignoring the very real negative impact of stealing from another culture. So, and this is a culture which is still punished and fetishized and othered. So my action was wrong, and my ignorance did not change that. And it's taken me a while to really learn that and internalize that.
I see. Since you plead ignorance for being naughty, you are so self-centered that you think everyone else does the same. If those college lads get away with it, well, then surely I, a superior virtue-signaling social justice warrior, can pawn off excuses as the truth. In reality, what you are talking about is those microaggressions. Surely no one who is imbued with common sense would have a problem with wanting to celebrate a holiday. It's just the SJW echo chamber going so far into the micro world of aggressions that they need an electron microscope to find fault. You say the negative impact of stealing from another culture. What actually happens when you wanted to celebrate the Day of the Dead? That the souls of the departed will become unable to return to Earth to visit with and to provide counsel or give guidance to family and loved ones?
White ignorance, then, is an active, educated ignorance perpetuated by a system that is shaped by white supremacy. It's held in place by a collective sense of history which privileges white narratives and downplays what might make white people uncomfortable. It's perpetuated every time we choose to stay ignorant because it's easier, because we think it saves us from having to take responsibility, but it does not save us.
Please, please, please think of the children. I assume you went to university to take all these gender studies and critical theory courses. So being educated yourself, you may want to learn to become a good example to others. We cannot have educated ignorance. The two words by their meaning alone make them unworkable in any sentence. Ignorance by its very nature is due to the lack of information and, well, education. You again conflate ignorance with excuses. Do you know the difference? Here are two sentences that use both words properly. Officer, I didn't know this town had curfew laws. That's ignorance. Or, I'm sorry, my dog ate my homework. Is an excuse. Sorry about the mansplaining. I didn't know it was offensive. That was an example of a joke.
And as long as this ignorance persists, society will remain segregated and racially unjust.
As long as identity politics and out of control political correctness persist, with the insistence on constant labels for everything and everyone, we will be left with those that you oppose and your side who are a mirror image of the extreme political right, and we will be none the better for it.
And at some point, us white people, we need to take responsibility for rectifying this kind of ignorance, for challenging what we're taught in school and in society, and making a point of listening and believing what we're told by non-white people about how to make things better.
So, only white people need to take responsibility for ourselves. But of course, because to say that any minority should take social responsibility would be racist. Am I right? These non-white people have all the answers and they need to educate us. Sounds fair.
We need to get over our discomfort with conversations about race because it's our collective memory and efforts which affect our abilities to move beyond this kind of ignorance.
I'm sorry, but I have no memory, collective or otherwise, that I need to account for. I hope to think that I've led a decent life. As we mature, we learn that the world does not revolve around our own self, and as we hopefully improve with age, each person as they can, we learn to be considerate of others. You may have been a snotty teenager but learned wisdom, no matter how humble. It teaches us that there are others around us and to treat them kindly. A friend once said about a group of politicians that they must not be Christians as they claim because they would be fearing for going to hell one day because of their action. We are a deliberate species. As we gain more knowledge about the world, I hope that we improve. The politicians my friend complained about likely acted with full knowledge that their actions were immoral. It doesn't mean that they, as self-described Christians, were ignorant of the fires of hell. It just means they were willfully greedy or corrupt.
So I think this is something that it's really nuanced, but it's also really important for us to start thinking about and talking about, and to be upfront about the ways that we have used and still use ignorance to get out of what we thinking we're getting out of responsibility, but realizing that that's not really how it works. So I hope that this was helpful. I look forward to reading your comments, and I'll see y'all.
I have to think that the child who used the excuse of the dog eating his homework would have learned that it didn't work. The college lads who feigned ignorance about blackface probably learned from their mistake. In the case of the college kids, the mistake was getting caught, as they were more than likely quite aware of what they were doing was offensive. You do sound like you've been to university and read a few books, and now, like many on the SJW side of life, think that you understand the world and know all the answers. For thousands of years, wise men and philosophers have got it all wrong until you came along to straighten us out and social justice explain the world. Seedling, I do not wish you ill will, and I thank you for sharing your thoughts. Obviously, I disagree with many of them, but this is sometimes how a meaningful dialogue is started or continued. If you or anyone else disagree with the opinions expressed in this video, please put it below in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if indeed you liked it, and subscribe, and also join us on social media. And consider supporting this channel on Patreon, which was just rolled out a few days ago. Thank you, and so long, and thanks for all the fish.